Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful conference. So to begin, let me see if I know how to use this. Hopefully I did this. No? Okay, wait a minute. Wait, here you go. Here you go. I have no disclosures. So I think everyone here would agree that making the diagnosis of cirrhosis is incredibly important, and because of all the management issues that result from it. But I think we also recognize that cirrhosis historically has been a histological diagnosis, but the reality of it is that fibrosis continues even after cirrhosis. And in fact, cirrhosis is very asymptomatic. So we are often making this diagnosis way too late. We know that hepatic decompensation results in a marked decrease in survival from 12 years to 2 years. And so this asymptomatic period is a time when we really need to make that diagnosis. Liver biopsy, the historical way of making it, as you know, is imperfect. First of all, it's incredibly invasive. There's a 25% risk of pain after a biopsy. There's actually a 1% risk of serious complications, and as much as a 0.2% risk of death from a biopsy. So you can imagine why things have become much less popular. There's also sampling errors, because you know that we don't really, we're not able to, not all diseases are homogeneous. In fact, most are heterogeneous. On top of that, your pathologist, from one person to another, will have variability in the reading. So as a result of this, I think over time, we've become more adept at using non-invasive markers. We routinely use serum biomarkers. We now use transient elastography or other elastography methods. But I think we don't recognize that a lot of regular clinical imaging can tell you the diagnosis of cirrhosis, particularly MRIs and CT scans, cross-sectional imaging. So, as I mentioned, serum biomarkers are great. They're cheap. They're easily done. They're usually based on AST, ALT ratios, and platelet count. But, as I mentioned to you before, CT is actually really good. We all know when we see a very severe cirrhosis that you can see signs of portal hypertension, you can see splenomegaly, ascites, recannulation of umbilical vein, you can see the nodularity, hypertrophy of the caudate lobe, and atrophy of the right lobe. But the reality of it is that oftentimes, if the finding is subtle, it is not read out. So in this study that we did many years ago, we looked at patients who had a biopsy and a CT within 6 months of each other. And we looked at how many times radiologists will call the cirrhosis. It turns out, as you probably see every day, they read it with high specificity. So it has to be really obvious or they won't read it, because they're not going to put their reputation if they're not quite sure. So subtle signs aren't where they're going to read it. So sensitivity is very low. Actually, they could increase their specificity if they would actually do some measurements. So for example, if you do draw a line in the main portal vein, draw a line to the, see if I can, I don't know if I can do that. Draw a line with the edge of the caudate lobe. You can measure the distance of the caudate to right lobe ratio. And this actually can increase the likelihood of being able to read cirrhosis with an AUC of 0.71. But I don't know about your radiologist. Unless I really ask them for a favor, they're not going to do that, because it's very tedious and it takes time. And they are not likely to do it voluntarily. So in fact, if we could build this into the CT scanner, you could potentially have these readings. And in fact, there's actually a lot more evidence in there. You know, we get a CT scan, we get our question answered, but there's actually a lot of information. Just imagine when you get a CT scan, everything about your body is there. You can show the phenotype, but more importantly, you can actually think about something called morphomics, because morphomics is like all the information that's in there, just like you have genotype, but you also have genomics, which is all your genes. So just imagine that there is a lot of information there that is left on the table. So similar to phenotype versus morphomics, one way to phenotype somebody is to calculate a BMI. So a BMI is very easy. But let me pose to you that a BMI doesn't tell you everything. So imagine the gentleman on the left versus a gentleman on the right. They have the same BMI of 27.5, but you can imagine that their cardiovascular risk is very different. And in fact, if you look at this wrestler, Steve Austin, at the height of his career, he was 114 kilograms and 6'2". So technically, he's obese. Can you imagine calling him obese? And in fact, if you look at all the Olympians, you can look at the basketball player, LeBron James, Holly Mango, the weightlifter, Ryan Hall, the marathon runner, Michael Phelps, the swimmer, and Gabby Douglas. In fact, they are all somewhat abnormal in that only 2 have a normal BMI. The rest of them are overweight, obese, or underweight. So I think that there's a lot of information other than a BMI. And one of the things that are very important in liver disease is actually muscle mass. This is a study we published many years ago. If you simply draw the psoas muscle at L4 in a CT scan, and you just measure the area of this muscle that's very easily visible on a CT scan, and you look at patients who undergo liver pre-transplant, if you look at them and you calculate their post-transplant survival, what you will find is if you take a group of 1,000 patients and you divide them by their quartile of psoas muscle, you can see that those people in the top 25% largest psoas muscle actually have a greater than 80% survival 1 year, as opposed to someone who has the lowest 25% quartile with a survival of 45%. So simple muscle measurement that is on a CT scan done for other reasons can actually predict 1 year mortality. So how do you do this? I mean, we could just measure, but none of us have time. Radiologists don't have time. We don't have time. It's a pain. So one thing you could do is actually try to do this automatically or try to just quantify things. So one of the things is, you know, we are all in the age of AI. We're all in the age of image analysis. And the way that this is done is just essentially convert an image to numbers. So this CT of a liver, what you see is that it is made of many little spots, pixels. And these pixels basically is a grayscale image. And you basically convert each pixel to a number. So if it's black, it's 0. If it's white, it's 256. Sorry, I went back. But the, I don't know why I did that. So if you do that, you can actually then create ways to measure. So the platform that we use is analytic morphomics, but you can use any quantitative image analysis platform. The key thing that we use with this is that we store all the data in a 3-dimensional database, and we also anatomically index it. And we've done this for over 200,000 CT scans. So let me see if I can move this. Okay, so what is anatomic indexing? It's essentially the fact that we reference each CT scan to the spinal level. And why is that important? It's because you want to make the measurements automatic, consistent, and repeatable. And so the issue is if you don't anatomically index it to the person, what happens is if the patient's lying slightly off, you may not have as accurate a measurement. It is absolutely not necessary, but it does make it more easy to compare people to people. So once we measure that, we can look at every level and you can measure things like muscle. So there are many different ways to measure muscles. I mentioned the psoas muscle, which is very easy to see on that red square. You can also measure what a lot of people measure, which is all the muscle in one area, in one slice of your liver, of your abdomen. You can also measure the back muscles. But other than muscles, there's actually a lot of other things you can measure. Sorry. I seem to have, here you go. So you can measure all kinds of body compositions. So once you anatomically index, You can measure bone features because all the bones are there. You can measure, as I mentioned, all the muscles. You can measure muscle density because it's a CT scan. You can measure the fat because fat is at a different density. And you can measure fat density, which is very important. You can measure organs like liver and spleen. So, to this, until recently, a lot of this is done manually. And one of the problems with being manual is that, first of all, it's tedious. And second of all, if it's a liver, you could probably, be pretty precise at drawing where the liver is. But if it was like a cancer, like liver cancer, if you take 4 radiologists and ask them where the cancer is, you can see that there's 4 different circles. So if you want this to be consistent, you might want to do this automatically. And that is where AI comes in. But before I do that, so remember I told you we draw things and we make sure we know what we're measuring? You can actually not have to do that. The way technology works is you could just feed the images in and have a black box prediction. So if I just put all the images in and I say, which one of these patients have cirrhosis, just tell me. They can actually do that, right? They can predict it based on all those pixels. But I want to point out to you this study. This was done quite a while ago. So this is a study where they gave all the images to a computer and they said, listen, which one of this is a husky and which one is a dog? Which one is a husky and which one is a wolf? Sorry. You can see wolves and husky look really similar. And this model did so well. 90% of the time, they were able to tell the difference between a husky and a wolf. But let me tell you, if you dig deeper and you ask the computer, how are you deciding that? You would think they're looking at the face. No, they're looking at whether there's snow on the ground. So that is where the black box can be a problem. You want to be very careful about what exactly you're measuring, because if you just tell blindly a black box, you don't know what the reason that it's predicting certain things. So we use mostly artificial intelligence to do segmentation. What is segmentation? It's basically outlining the things that are there. So for example, here you can tell where the cat is, where the trees are, and where the sky is, and then we make measurements. I think that in many ways for doctors, that's a little bit easier to believe because you actually know what you're measuring, sort of. So we have done this using this convolutional neural network, which is a very common way of doing image analysis with artificial intelligence, and automatically measure things like psoas. And you can see that in our, we show them what the ground truth is, what the psoas should look like, and they measure it. And you can see that if you put the ones that we do manually versus with artificial intelligence, they're very similar, both in normal kidney donors as well as the cirrhosis cohort. We also did this with other measurements like the fat, the muscle, and other things. And what we found that clinically, these automated measurements actually can be very predictive of outcomes. So for example, in this cirrhosis cohort, MELD was predictive of mortality with a C statistic of 0.66. But you can then add, with labs, you can add a CT scan, you can actually improve the prediction of mortality. So similarly, you can use this to predict cirrhosis. So once you segment out the liver, you can actually create measurements that essentially measure the caudate to right lobe ratio. You can create algorithms that look at how nodular the liver is, and also differences in shape that you may not know. Actually, when your liver becomes cirrhotic, it actually flattens out. So I think that's not something we usually see when we look at a cross-sectional imaging, but when you look at three-dimensional, that's what happens to the liver. And we published this a number of years ago showing that doing these readings, you can actually increase the prediction of cirrhosis. This is a cohort of patients with liver biopsy and CT, and you can see that the morphomics model, the one that has the imaging, had a much higher AURC of 0.9 versus simple serum markers like LOX score, OPRI, or FIB4. To further look at this and see if we can actually predict overall survival, other than just making a diagnosis of cirrhosis, we did a retrospective study of people in the VA system, the Veterans Health System, which is a very large integrated health system in the United States. And we stratified them with three main liver diseases, mast cell, alcohol, and hep C. And these are people who also had CT within 6 months of the diagnosis of any liver disease, these three liver diseases, sorry. So we found that compared to CTP, Child-Sturt-Cobb-Pugh score, which was calculated automatically from the cohort, we noted that if you add imaging biomarkers, which is the morphomics analysis of the CT scans, you can see that the prediction of mortality was much better with the addition of imaging biomarkers, and that you combining them with CT and blood markers increased your AURC even more. And we actually validated this externally at the University of Michigan cohort. Because the VA is mostly male, this model worked better with men. More importantly, we looked at prediction of hepatic decompensation. And in fact, the model worked very well. You can see that CTP in patients who have never previously decompensated, you can see that CTP had a C-index of 0.67, whereas the combined model had a C-index of 0.8 for the prediction of hepatic decompensation. So interestingly, like I said, you should always find out what your model is actually looking at. We found out that for overall survival, the variables that they were using in the deep learning model was mostly muscle and body composition features was predictive, as well as CTP. Interestingly, for hepatic decompensation, the important variables were liver features. So it appeared that the worse your liver is, more likely you were going to decompensate hepatically. So the take-home message is there is a lot of valuable information in cross-sectional imaging, such as CT scans, which can be useful, not only in helping diagnose cirrhosis, but to predict likelihood of important clinical outcomes like hepatic decompensation and mortality. Automating this process with artificial intelligence is the first step to potentially implementing this in the clinical arena. And this has added value because you already got the CT scans. These were all retrospective studies done for other reasons. And so imagine a day when you get in a CT scan and they put up, this is the likelihood this patient has cirrhosis, this is the likelihood of hepatic decompensation and mortality. You can get that added into your CT scan and get additional value. So thank you for listening. I also want to recognize that most of this work was not done by me, but by our group, the Morphomics Analysis Group. Thank you.